Well, good morning, family. It's Sunday, April the 5th, and I hope this finds everyone healthy and well. And we'll be continuing our studying by video conferencing until the coronavirus abates, which I hope will be very soon. So I'd like to welcome everybody into our study. 2 weeks ago, we finished studying Romans and chapter 8. And that, of course, is Paul's grand vision of what is to come. And then last week, we got into the remaining part of Romans, and we also covered the pastoral epistles and began our study of 1 Corinthians. So as is our practice, I'd like to review what we covered last week, just to set the context for our continuing study this week in 1 Corinthians. Romans 9 through 11 is a retelling of the story of Israel. And Paul's retelling of that story comes to a head right in the middle of chapter 10, with the resurrection of Jesus, the Messiah, being the centerpiece of it. In Romans chapter 10 and verse 4 and following, Paul said, "Christ is the end of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes." Moses describes in this way the righteousness that is by the law. The man who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, "Do not say in your heart, 'Who will ascend into heaven?' That is to bring Christ down, or 'Who will descend into the deep?' That is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, it is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith we are proclaiming, that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you confess and are saved." So the resurrection of Jesus is described here to Israel as the covenant renewing event. And belief in that event is the decisive act of Israel's God and is the defining characteristic of those who belong to this renewed covenant. Notice that Paul says that salvation, both for the Jew and the Greek, is predicated upon this belief that God raised Jesus from the dead. So any notion of salvation apart from acknowledging the bodily resurrection of Jesus is completely and totally foreign to Christianity. The final section of Romans in chapters 12 through 16 has further significant references to the resurrection. Romans chapter 12, verse 1, Paul says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." So Paul is saying that our bodies, our soma in the Greek, are the transition point here. The body is going to die because it remains corruptible and subject to the consequence of sin. However, it's going to be raised. And this makes it appropriate as the locus of our Christian worship and service. Then he goes on in Romans chapter 14, in the latter part of verse 10, he says, "For we will all stand before God's judgment seat." And as I pointed out last week, the Greek word that's used for standing here is that familiar term for resurrection, anastasis. It's against being still. And so the language of standing before God's judgment seat implicitly refers here to the resurrection, in that it certifies God's power to raise us from the dead. Not because we kept to any particular cultural code, which is the subject of what Romans, the latter part of Romans is talking about, but because we have lived as God's faithful servants. So that concludes our study of Romans, which we completed last week. We made brief mention of the pastoral epistles, which have relatively little to say about the resurrection. But in 2 Timothy chapter 2, Paul points out the problem with two characters, Hymenaeus and Philetus. In chapter 2 and verse 17, he says, Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have wandered away from the truth, they say that the resurrection has already taken place, and they destroy the faith of some. Hymenaeus and Philetus were teaching a viewpoint that subsequently would become popular in other Christian circles, and in fact is popular in many Christian circles today. And that is that the resurrection was to be interpreted not in terms of a future bodily resurrection after death, but purely as a spiritual experience that could be enjoyed in the present life. And Paul uses very strong language to condemn this heresy. He brings to mind the example of Dathan and Abiram in the Old Testament, who rebelled against Moses, rebelled against the hope that God had given them of a land that would be flowing with milk and honey coming true. And as a result, they were separated from Israel and were swallowed up by the earth. A rather dramatic end to their particular heresy. And Paul is using this as a warning to those who would commit the same heresy these days. Then we started into the resurrection in the Corinthian epistles, in particular, 1 Corinthians. And of course, the resurrection of both of Jesus and of his people is the dominant subject in the Corinthian epistles. And 1 Corinthians 15, and 2 Corinthians chapter 4 through chapter 5 are the central passages that deal with the resurrection there. We're going to save those for next week and the week following. But we got into the first part of 1 Corinthians, apart from chapter 15 last week. And I mentioned that it was very much like a stroll down a busy city street where you find all manner of human life. You find the squabbles, lawsuits, sex, shopping, rich, poor, worship, work, wisdom, folly, politics, religion, runs the gamut of all the rich panoply of humanity. And some of the people that we meet in 1 Corinthians are going to be very arrogant and exalted about their own importance. Other people are outcasts. They're on the edge of society. And 1 Corinthians really reflects the broad social condition that existed in Corinth at the time. The problem in Corinth was that the Corinthian Christians were trying to mix Christianity and paganism. Not surprising, because Corinth was definitely a pagan city. And their arrogance came about because they were supplanting the biblical teaching, in particular on the resurrection, with pagan philosophies that were prevalent in the popular culture of their time. And as I mentioned last week, that unfortunately that phenomenon of accommodating Christianity to whatever the popular culture of the time is, has persisted throughout the centuries since the epistle was written, and is just as much with us today, if not more, than it was back in the time of Paul's writing to Corinth. So Paul introduces in chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, in verses 10 through 17, the topic that's going to occupy him through chapter 4. And that is the personality cults that existed within the church there in Corinth. Some were saying, I am of Paul, others, I am of Apollos, others, I am of Cephas or Peter, and others, I am of Christ. And the way that Paul deals with this is interesting. He goes back to the foundation of the gospel. He points out that the wisdom unveiled by the gospel is not just some new way of organizing the concepts and the teachings of this present world. It's a revolutionary wisdom that has astounded the supposed wise, and it terrifies those who think they are in control in this present world. And that leads Paul to a fundamental contrast between two different kinds of people. And that contrast and the description that he gives of it points all the way to the description of the two different kinds of bodies that he will discuss when we get to chapter 15. On the one hand, you have the spiritual dominated people, and the Greek term there was pneumatikos. And on the other hand, you have the soul dominated person. The Greek word used there is psychikos. And I want you to remember those two words, because exactly the same Greek roots of those two words will be used as adjectives when we get to chapter 15 to describe the two different body types of the present body and of the resurrected body. The distinction that Paul draws between the psyche, or the soul in modern English, and the pneuma, or the spirit in modern English, is much more than just some lexical curiosity. It runs a whole lot deeper than what the words soul and spirit typically mean to the average reader in the modern world. And it will help us to understand those two terms when we get to chapter 15. The Greek word soma refers to one's body, one's physical space-time presence in this realm. And another Greek word, sarx, which is translated carnal, refers to the whole person seen in terms of one's corruptible or rebellious nature. Psyche captures what we would loosely call the personality or the worldview of a person. And the problem in Corinth was that the attitude of many of the Christians there, by and large, revealed them not just to be psychikos minded. They were squabbling and creating divisions in the church over all manners of things that basically revealed them to be sarkikos minded. They were concerned with the fleshly instincts that caused them to be sinful and rebellious. This fundamental contrast that Paul draws between the present age and the future age, and the sort of human existence and behavior that belong to each of those ages, is really of utmost importance for us to be able to understand what he's going to speak of in chapter 15, where those same terms are going to be used again in reference to the bodily resurrection. After Paul's opening rebuke over the divisions in the church that he gives in chapter 3 and verses 1 and 4, he then describes for the Christians how his and Apollos' work fit together in the plan and the calling of the one true God. We read from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, starting in verse 5, Paul says, "What, after all, is Apollos, and what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The man who plants and the man who waters have one purpose, and each will be rewarded according to his own labor, for we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building." The Corinthians would have probably been early subscribers to People magazine if it had existed back then, because they were thinking only in terms of personalities, not about the overall divine project and how it was proceeding and how the different gifts contribute to God's overall divine project. Paul and Apollos are two builders. One of them is laying the foundation. The other is erecting a structure, but God is the architect. However, the critical point that Paul is making has to do with eschatology here, because he says there is coming a day when the work of the builders is going to be judged in chapter 3 and verses 10 through 15. Let's read what he says there. By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as an expert builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should be careful how he builds, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If any man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, his work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and fire will test the quality of each man's work. If what he has built survives, he will receive his reward. If it's burned up, he will suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but only as one escaping through the flames. Now, this is a similar picture of judgment to what we find in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Romans chapter 2, Romans chapter 14, verses 10, and in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10. Nowhere else, though, in any of those verses do we see such a strong continuity across a fiery judgment between the work that is done in the present and the new world that God intends to make. Well-built houses will last. They will be part of the coming world. The Corinthians need to understand themselves, the church, and the work of their teachers within this eschatological narrative, that of the end times, which runs from the present age to the age to come. This continuity gives a specific focus to several aspects of 1 Corinthians, and it leads to Paul's admonition at the very end of chapter 15 that because of the future resurrection, they need to get on with their work in the present. 1 Corinthians 15:58 says, "Therefore, my dear brothers, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." And he reinforces that in chapter 6 and verses 16 and 17, where he invokes the image of the temple. He says there, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple. Anyone who destroys the temple of God by the bickering and the personality cults, that sort of thing that we found in the 1 Corinthians church there, they face the threat of being destroyed in the final judgment." And that should be a sobering admonition to all of us, to avoid causing division within the church over such trivial matters. It's tantamount to destroying God's temple. And the warning is that if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. So we don't want to go down that road. But behind this threat, we also hear a promise that's analogous to the one that we covered in Romans chapter 8. Namely, that the gospel project involves building a new temple, the long-awaited dwelling place of the divine name among all nations. And this project will be completed at the resurrection. Chapter 4 rounds off Paul's discussion of wisdom and personalities. And once again, he places it in the context of final judgment. "You are judging me," he tells the Corinthians, "but the only judgment that counts will come on the last day. And I'm happy to face that one." So this long opening section of 1 Corinthians chapters 1 through 4 is imploring the Corinthians to think eschatologically. In other words, think in view of the end of time. And more specifically, it's imploring them to understand the present in terms of the future that is already breaking in to the present. The need, in other words, is for them to be pneumatikoi rather than psychikoi, and still less sarkikoi. And chapters 5 and 6, Paul turns to the next set of specific issues that have been raised by the Corinthians who came to see him while he was in Ephesus. There's a case of incest in the church. A man was living with his stepmother, and Christians are suing each other in pagan courts. And Paul's response is that Christians must not compromise with the present world, but rather must live in the light of the future world. And this will involve judgment, both the future judgment that's going to come on the day of the Lord in chapter 5 and verse 5 and again in 13. It also involves the present judgment that the Christian community has to exercise in disciplining the offender, which Paul describes in chapter 5 and verses 3 through 5. He says this man is to be banished from their fellowship in order that his sinful nature, again, the Greek is sarkos there, in the present world might be destroyed, so that his spirit, his pneuma, might be saved in the end. Judgment is again at issue in chapter 6. This time it's because the church is committing the unthinkable sin of going to law before unbelievers. Paul says, don't you know that the saints will judge the world in chapter 6, verse 2, and even the angels in chapter 6, verse 3? How would we respond today to this question? This remarkable statement is really based upon Paul's vivid awareness of Jewish texts like Daniel chapter 7, which we studied quite a while ago, in which the people of the saints of the Most High are given authority to execute judgment over the beasts and to rule the nations. Now, of course, Paul understands that this is a shared judgment with Christ. But once again, he's drawing conclusions from the present, from what will be true in the future. This is how things will be, so this is how they must be for now. We have to learn to think in terms of the world that is to be, and then we will see clearly how to behave in the present time. And Paul then returns in chapter 6 to the wider issue of Christian morality, and particularly with regard to sexual behavior, and within that more particularly to prostitution, which he discusses in chapter 6 and verse 9 through 20. And what counts here, he says, is inheriting the kingdom of God, chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. But Paul doesn't often use that phrase, but when he does, it mostly refers to the final kingdom that will be instated when Jesus has finished his work of bringing all the enemies of the true God and his creation into subjection, as we'll see when we get to chapter 15 and verses 24 to 28. But in particular, Paul's argument in chapter 6 and verses 12 through 20 depends on his belief that what is done in the present body matters, precisely because that body is to be raised. And this continuity between the present body and the future resurrection body is what gives weight to the ethical imperative that he gives in chapter 6 and verse 13 through 17. He says there in 1 Corinthians 6, the latter part of 13, the body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body. For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But he who unites himself with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Verse 14 that we just read here is the key. The resurrection of Jesus and that of believers are both accomplished by God's divine power. The Greek word that's used there is dynamis, which is the same word from which we get dynamite in English language. Therefore, the same body that might be abused in immoral behavior is meant for the Lord and the Lord for the body. In other words, God intends to raise the body. Dalliance with prostitutes, or for that matter, any other kind of sexual immorality, is the ultimate debasement of the one flesh that is the essence of the sexual union between two individuals. And that's what makes it so reprehensible for Christians. God has higher plans for our bodies, both in this world, where they are a temple or a residence place of the Holy Spirit, and in the world to come after the resurrection. So what we presently do with our bodies matters mightily, no matter what Plato and those of this present world would say about it. Through the redemption that takes place upon the Messiah's death, God has purchased the whole person, including the body, as he describes in chapter 6 and verse 19 and 20. And God intends to make good on that purchase in the future. Why is there so much immorality in the world today, even among Christians, unfortunately? Is it not because those involved in immoral behaviors have adopted the Platonic viewpoint that what I do with my body doesn't really matter in the long run? If we don't teach our young people about the bodily resurrection and the continuity that it represents between our present bodies and our future bodies, then it's no wonder that they are so easily seduced into immoral behavior. Plato says, go for it. Your present body is just a temporary dwelling, and the only thing immortal about you is your soul. Paul says, nonsense. It matters what you do with your present body, because God has plans for it that are eternal. When we get to chapter 7, which is a discourse on marriage, it's in one sense the antidote to the kind of rampant immorality that often culminates in prostitution or other kinds of sexual immorality. The message of chapter 7 is that the marriage bed is the only proper outlet for our sexual passions, and therefore the marriage bond is not to be dissolved. Then we go on into chapters 8 through 10, which deal with food that is offered to idols. Now, bear in mind that being a very pagan and idolatrous city, almost all of the meat that was on sale in a city like Corinth would have been derived from sacrifices offered in idol temples. And Paul teaches that the way to address this problem is to recognize that where you belong in the eschatological narrative. That narrative is the Jewish story of the Creator's good world and of how it has been redeemed by the Messiah. And through that story, you'll learn how to regulate your apparent rights and freedoms with the overarching responsibilities that are also yours because of who and what you are in the Messiah. It would have been easy for a devout Jew in Corinth to retreat from the idolatrous world that he observed into a safe sphere beyond the reach of contamination. And if that meant eating no meat at all for fear of eating what had been offered to idols, that was the route many Jews would have taken. And it was natural that within the Christian community in Corinth, some would be inclined to take that same route. Others, like Paul, would take a more robust view of the created order, and they would have no scruples of conscience about eating anything at all. So how should the church cope with this? Well, it might appear to be safer to retreat from the world, but that would imply that the one true God was not, after all, the creator of the present world, and equally that he was not intending to claim it as his own in a great new act of creation. And that's why in chapter 10, verse 26, Paul quotes from Psalms 24:1. He says, "The earth belongs to the Lord with all its fullness." However, to avoid offending a weaker brother, it's better to live with their misunderstanding than to insist that someone act against their own conscience. Resurrection is the goal for all of us, and this makes it easier to forego some things to which we might have a right. Then we get to chapters 11 through 14, which deal with the subject of worship and love. The main difficulty in the church at Corinth was their accentuation of social divisions within the church rather than their abolition of such divisions, especially when it came to celebrating the Lord's Supper. And we again see the now but not yet aspect of this present world for Christians. In Paul's often quoted assertion in chapter 11, verse 26, he says, "As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you announce the Lord's death until he comes." So the Lord's Supper is a bridge between what happened in the past, Jesus' death, what happens in the present in the church, and what will happen in the future when he comes. The long and involved chapters 12 and 14 are separated by the short and deeply poetic chapter 13. This chapter is often read at weddings as a paean to love. But we have often overlooked the now not yet tension of Christians living that it portrays. Love is the ultimate bridge from present Christian living into the future kingdom. Many things don't last, but love does. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, starting in verse 8, "Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." Love is what will hold the church together when various pressures threaten to pull the Lord's body apart, whether they be different gifts, enthusiasms for a particular teacher, a sense of one's own rights without regard for those of others, or a failure to recognize those of different social standing as being equal at the Lord's table. The point of chapter 13 and verses 3 through 13 is that the church must be working in the present on the things that will last into God's future. Faith, hope, and love will do this. Prophecy, tongues, and knowledge, which were so highly prized by the Corinthians, will not. They are mere signposts, not the destination. To hold the church in Corinth together, Paul needs to teach them love. But in order to teach them love, he also needs to teach them eschatology. So all the lines of this letter, 1 Corinthians, are now pointing toward chapter 15, where he addresses this topic in great detail. The final greeting of the 1 Corinthian letter contains the invocation that places the emphasis where Paul knew that it needed to be. When faced with a church that was all too inclined to live in the present and to collapse God's future plans back into pagan philosophy and to live for themselves instead of the coming Lord. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, the latter part of verse 22, he says, "Come, O Lord." And throughout this letter, Paul continually stresses to the Corinthians the vital importance of living in the present on the basis not only of the past events of the gospel, but also of the future events that those gospel events guarantee. So it's not surprising that 1 Corinthians 15 is what it is and is located where it is in this letter. So we'll conclude the lesson at this point today. Next week, we'll get into the discussion of resurrection in the 2 Corinthian epistle, other than the detailed description in chapter 4, verse 7 through chapter 5 and verse 11. And we'll probably get on into the first part of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 next week. I hope you all stay safe and healthy, and let's get through this pandemic together. Bye-bye now.